Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Please raise your hand within the Go to Train and Control panel if you can hear me loud and clear. It's coming out garbled. What I will do, is it still garbled? There's an echo. No, okay, everything is fine now? Excellent, excellent. Alrighty, so before we begin, I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Please raise your hand within the Go to Train and Control panel if you can hear me loud and clear. I know that several of you are saying yes, so that's a good sign. You have all joined in listen-only mode due to the number of registrants we have today. On the left-hand side of the control panel, you will see 4 icons. Please click on the hand and arrow icon, which is the bottom one, to raise your hand. My name is Lance Watsky, and I will serve as the webinar producer for our session today, the last in our series. Before we dive into today's webinar, I'd like to first provide some logistical information to assist those of you less familiar with the Go to Train and webinar interface. Just because you've joined in listen-only mode doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. There's a chat box in your control panel. We'll be taking questions today via the chat box, which is the bottom tab on the control panel. Please feel free to send questions along to the entire group, or you can send them directly to me, the AMIA webinar producer. I will be fielding all questions and send them along to our presenter at specific intervals and breaks in the presentation. Our presenter will also be keeping an eye on your questions. We've muted the audio on all participants, so chatting your way is your way of letting us hear from you. At this point, I'm going to load our presenter, Barry Lunt's presentation for you all to follow along. I'd like to now introduce today's presenter, Barry Lunt. Dr. Barry Lunt has taught electronics, engineering technology, and information technology at Brigham Young University since 1993, where he now serves as full professor and director of the School of Technology. He has also taught electronics at Utah State University and Snow College. Prior to his work in academics, he worked for 7 years as a design engineer for IBM in Tucson, Arizona. He has consulted for several companies, has worked summer internships for Bell Labs, now Lucent Technologies, Lawson Davis in Utah, IBM, Vermont, and Micron Technologies in Utah and Idaho. His research areas are permanent digital data storage and engineering and computer education. Dr. Lunt is the author of Electronic Physical Design from Pearson Prentice Hall, 2004, and The Marvels of Modern Electronics from Dover, 2013. He has produced more than 70 peer-reviewed publications in the areas of electronic physical design, engineering education, and permanent data storage. He has 7 U.S. patents and 20 more that he has applied for. It's now my great honor to turn the webinar over to Dr. Barry Lunt.
Next slide, please. So the storage options that we have today for digital data are hard disk drives, which have been around for a long time, magnetic tape, such as the LTO cartridge that you see here, optical discs, such as the example here, and then flash memory, whether it's in the stick form here or in solid-state drives. Those are basically the only four options that exist. These, of course, are both magnetic tapes and hard disk drives. These are purely optical, and most of them, and these are solid state. We'll talk about what solid state means later on. Now let's talk a bit about the storage hierarchy. One of the things that we always want with storage is that it be fast, that we have a short access time. And the way that I've specified access time here is in the number of cycles. So a computer, for instance, running at 1 gigahertz would have a cycle every 1 nanosecond, or 1 billionth of a second. And so the example here means that it would take 2 cycles, or 2 nanoseconds approximately, for data to be obtained from onboard registers. These are right on the microprocessor. Unfortunately, the big disadvantage of onboard registers is that they have an extremely small storage capacity. We see in the blue arrow over here that the storage capacity goes up as we move up this hierarchy, but the access time goes down. That's the opposite of what we want. We would love very fast access time and very large amounts of storage, but such doesn't exist today. Maybe sometime in the future it will. So above the onboard registers, we have what we call cache memory, which is made out of static random access memory. We'll talk more about that in this webinar. It has an access time of about 10 cycles, and it's also volatile, as are the onboard registers. Now, volatile means that the data in it disappears when the power is lost. So this is obviously not useful for long-term storage. But as long as the computer is powered on, the data is stable in this form. Typical computers today will have 256 meg, maybe even half a gigabyte of cache memory. Rarely more than that. It's much more expensive. What this hierarchy also doesn't show is cost, but you can assume that the cost per bit goes down as we move up here. Certainly these are most expensive. Next in line we have our main memory. That's our DRAM, or dynamic random access memory, which again we'll talk about more later. But it's quite a bit slower. Notice that it's about 5 times slower than the cache memory. But that's what you talk about when you say how much memory your computer has. Typically today they're anywhere from 4 to 8 or maybe 16 gigabytes of memory. Throughout this, by the way, I will be using the term bits and bytes. Bits, of course, that's the smallest unit of digital data storage, a 1 or a 0. A byte is 8 of those, and I will adhere to that standard since that's the standard that I'm most familiar with. On the very top of that, we have hard disk drives, CD, DVD, Blu-ray disc, so the optical drives here, and we have flash drives. The nice thing about these forms of storage is that they are non-volatile. So what we need to have last for a long time is stored there. Unfortunately, this stuff is extremely slow. Notice 10 million cycles versus 50. It's many orders of magnitude slower than main memory or cache memory or onboard registers. But we are willing to pay the penalty of the slow access time because clearly we need something that's non-volatile, and that's where things are stored. So when you turn on your computer, for instance, the programs that you want to run, such as your operating system, your browser, your word processor, those are stored on your hard disk drive and are brought into the main memory to run from there. Or they may be stored on your flash drive or maybe on an optical disc. So let's talk just a bit about what's called file dispositions. The term has multiple meanings, so I want to address all of those. One of those dispositions is that the file is either open or closed. The file that is open is that status of the file, that it's open, is stored by the operating system because it's a bad thing to have 2 people playing with the same file at the same time. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do it. There are programs that allow that. But the operating system has to keep track of that. and that's what is done in terms of the disposition, whether it's either open or closed. Files can also be at rest, meaning that they're presently stored on the computer, or they might be in transmission, and that's another type. The third type is whether it's what type of storage tier it's in. And storage comes in 4 tiers. I've seen sometimes referred to as just 3, but I've also seen 4, so I'm going to use the 4 tiers here. Tier 1 is the backbone of the internet. That's what stores the cloud. That is on a RAID array. We'll talk about RAID later on. That is a redundant array of inexpensive disks or drives. And that's tier 1. That's ready to be accessed anytime, and it's always backed up. And the access time is usually much less than a second, but it's the most expensive. Tier 2 is a lower type of storage, lower performance type of storage, meaning it takes a longer time to access. So 1 to 5 second access time, but it's less expensive, and that's its main advantage. Tier 3 is backed up, and it's online. So it's stored on some kind of medium, usually tape, magnetic tape, and it's available, but its access time is much slower, 5 to 30 seconds. But it's a lot less expensive. And then finally, there's this tier 4, which is offline storage, meaning it's not stored where you can readily access it. Some person has to go retrieve it and then put it in a reading device that is online, so therefore it can be read that way. And that has a much longer access time. 1 to 24 hours is typical. This is also known as deep archival storage, and it's of course the least expensive, but it's not very practical for ready access. A few things about storage characteristics. We care about the access time, which I've talked about before. That is the time from when data is needed until it's available. Looks like I just jumped ahead a slide somehow. Sorry, I do not seem to have keyboard control over the slides. This is not good. Previous slide. I need to go to the previous slide. If the producer can back me up a slide. Okay, back here. I have control again. This is good. So we've talked about access time. Another factor that is characteristic is often talked about is IOPS, or input-output operations, input-output operations per second. And that's just basically how many times a storage device can respond to a request for data in a period of time, in 1 second of time. And that ranges from 10 to 1,500,000. Very wide range here. Back to this on access time, typical range is from a nanosecond up to about 30 seconds, which of course is a much longer time. Another thing is the data rate, which is the rate at which data flows to and from the storage device. And we want that to be very large. Typically it ranges from 1 megabit per second to up to 40 gigabits per second. Sorry about that problem there. It should be BPS, not PBS. Power consumption. We want that to be very small. It's the amount of power that a particular storage device uses, and that can range from milliwatts to kilowatts depending on how much storage and how fast things are. Another characteristic we care about often is the archival life expectancy, or LE, of the data, which is simply how long will the physical data persist. Data is stored as some kind of physical parameter. It's either magnetic or optical or charge. It's either electrons, and that's what persists. That's what the data is, and we would like that to be very large because we like data to last a long time. And typically today that can be anywhere from a year to 1,000 years, but even less than a year on some things that are volatile, of course, because those don't last long at all if you turn the power off. And finally, capacity, which is how much data can be stored in a given device. And of course, ideally, we'd want that to be very large. Today it ranges anywhere from about 600 megabytes to 10 terabytes. And above and below that, these aren't exact numbers. So let's start talking about the various types of storage, beginning with hard disk drives. These were developed way back in the 1960s. The first one was the RAMAC, invented by a team at IBM. And it was the first hard disk drive. And by the way, those disks were 24 inches in diameter, rather huge. The amazing things about these is they are made out of aluminum or glass, most of them aluminum, but today some drives are made out of glass, and you put a thin layer of magnetic material on top of that. These have to be extremely flat, within 1 nanometer. And to give you an idea, your hair is about 70,000 nanometers wide. So imagine something 1/70,000th of your hair's width in flatness. That's an extreme amount of flatness. It uses a flying head, which literally flies or floats on a cushion of air above the surface of the disk. That flying height is about 5 nanometers, or about 2,000 times closer than the thickness of your hair. Over the years, over the decades, the density has continued to increase following Moore's law, which is the law that allows us to increase the number of transistors in a given amount of space. The reason for that, by the way, is that the technology that allows us to store and read back data from hard disk drive surfaces has been driven by solid-state manufacturing or integrated circuit manufacturing technology. So it's no surprise that Moore's law is a reason for that. Unfortunately, with the increase in density, there has been no increase whatsoever in the reliability of these hard disk drives. They only last a few years. Everybody knows that when they fail, they typically have a catastrophic failure, a head crash where the head literally crashes into the surface of the disk. Of course, that causes either the head's destroyed or the data is destroyed. Either way, you can't get the data back because these drives are not interchangeable. You can't take a drive out and put a new one in and have the head align with it. It doesn't work. They're also prone to mechanical problems, especially bearing wear. Obviously, these things are constantly spinning unless you power them down, but they're useless if they're powered down. So they're usually spinning all the time, and of course they're running on bearings, and that means that eventually the bearings have to wear out. When that happens, you start getting some eccentricities on the bearings, which means that there is a slight amount of variation in where the head is with respect to the disk. It's where the disk is with respect to the head, I guess is a better way to put that. Which means because the tracks are only 200 nanometers apart, and again that means that we have about 1,000 of these tracks in the width of a human hair. Clearly, any eccentricity of the disk will cause the head to not be able to stay on top of the track because it's going to wobble a little bit, the track is. And so we get what we call seek errors, meaning we're trying to find the data on the disk, we find it but then lose it, find it, lose it every time the disk rolls around, every time the bearing rolls around. So that's the nature of the problems on hard drives. Because they're mechanical, they can't last forever, but they have very high capacities, and because they're not very reliable, we always back them up with redundancy. So more about them. The capacities today are in the multiple terabytes. Not unusual to find 10 terabyte hard drives. By the way, way back in the day of the IBM PC, which is about 1984, these were 10 megabytes. So it's pretty amazing that we've gone from mega to giga to terabytes in a single hard drive, and we've actually made the drive smaller. So the density has gone up orders and orders of magnitude. These are relatively inexpensive. They're usually only in the hundreds of dollars, and they're always online. They have what we call random access, which means the time to get to this file is the same amount of time as to get to that file, because they're not in sequence like on magnetic tape. That would be what we call sequential access. However, their access time is slow, and by slow, of course, I mean relative to the speed of the computer. 3 to 15 milliseconds, that's thousandths of a second. So if we were to watch the hard disk drive operate, that would look fast to our eye. But because the computer is operating in the nanosecond region, something running in the milliseconds, which is thousandths of a second, is dreadfully slow. Because these have, the data rate is usually quite good, upwards of 500 megabits per second, very high data rates. Those have continued to grow substantially over the years with hard drives. And because they have a fairly high failure rate, we put them in RAID configurations. And that means that you have the data in at least 2 different places, 2 different drives. So that if one drive fails, you simply take it out and put in another one. And as soon as you put in the new one, the system that is keeping this RAID working recognizes that a new disk is there. It takes the data that was on it before, gets it from its redundant location, puts it on there, and so only a few seconds later, or minutes, we have all the data that was on the other dead hard drive replaced on this new one, and so we now again have it redundant. And that's really, really common. So the data is fully mirrored. We also have parity checking. If that's not a term that's familiar, we'll talk about it a little bit more later on. As I mentioned before, hard disk drives are the backbone of cloud storage. When you store something on the cloud, it is on some hard drive somewhere. And they're also available in single external hard disk drives. You can buy them for computers. As I mentioned, they're relatively inexpensive. They have quite reasonable capacities. But if you have a single hard drive external to your computer, it is not rated. It's not backed up. You do not inherently have some kind of backup. That's something to always be aware of. If you are storing things for long periods of time on hard disk drives, you should be aware also that they are notorious for having a relatively high failure rate, even when not in use. And I don't know that there's time to talk about why that's the case, but it is, and it's very concerning. So we mentioned already what a RAID is, a redundant array of inexpensive disks or drives. There's also 2 others that you may have heard about: NAS, which is network attached storage, and SAN, which is storage attached area network. Excuse me. You look at those, you think they'll sound like the same thing, but just in backwards order, which is almost true, and they are very, very similar. We'll talk about the differences in an upcoming slide. Before we do that, we should talk about RAID levels. Now, the RAID levels are not in some kind of increasing value. They're just in different numbers. The levels start at 0 and include up to 50, sometimes called 50 or 50. And each of these types of RAID is a different application or a different way of doing it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It simply means that it is more useful for certain types of applications. The first level is properly called 0 because it really isn't redundancy at all. It is done by striping, which just means we get faster data. Striping is, if we look down here at the bottom, striping is storing data on multiple platters. In the previous picture, you recall that a hard disk is a platter of aluminum with the magnetic material on top. So if we have multiple platters, and by the way, I can store data on the top and bottom of both platters. So if I have 2 platters, therefore I have 4 surfaces. So if I write to all 4 surfaces at the same time, I can get 4 times the data rate, and that's what we call striping. So, and we can do it bitwise or bytewise or block size or whatever. We can split it up in many different ways, but the point of it is you get a high read-write performance, but it has no redundancy, which is why it's level 0. And then we just have different versions of RAID as we go through 1, 1E, 5, 5E6, level 0, 0, 1, 0, 1E0, and 5, 0. I'm not sure that it's worth time, unless you have a specific question, to go over each one of these, but you can see their respective advantages here, and in redundancy, the type of redundancy that's done here, the read-write performance, and the number of disks that are required to implement that level of RAID. You can see that that does go up, clear up to 6 in level 50 or 50 of RAID storage. I see a question here that says, what is parity? That's a good question. I do plan to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about cyclic redundancy check, or CRC, when we talk about how to determine the health of our data. So I'm going to postpone that question for now. It's certainly a good one. Times, there we go. Looks like we've backed up. Okay. Network attached storage, a few characteristics of it, and by the way, I don't want to belabor the difference between NAS and SAN because they are very similar in many ways, but we'll talk a little bit about the differences. NAS is a file-level computer data storage server connected to a computer network providing data across to access to a heterogeneous group of clients. Many different kinds of clients, all accessing the same thing. This is from Wikipedia. in shorter terms, it is a server with dedicated storage. So you have a computer whose job is to provide files and store them, and it has storage that is dedicated to that server. Cannot be used by any other storage or network or any other computer or server. And it's built for serving to a network. It's basically a server on steroids because it has that dedicated storage for it. And it's usually rated for reasons that we've talked about, the catastrophic failure mechanism of hard disk drives. It is a self-contained solution to sharing files over a network. So once you have a NAS, it's self-contained. You can add another NAS or you can expand that NAS, but it by itself is a solution to sharing files over a network. So if you wanted to build that file sharing capability into a system you were putting together, NAS would provide that for you. And it does include a file system, the network attached storage. SAN, which is Storage Area Network, means it's a network that has storage. So an example is shown here of the difference between the two. Here we have our network and file servers. Here we have block level storage for the SAN, which is what it has. And over here for the NAS, we have different file systems, NFS or AFS or SMB. Back to the SAN here, it groups all the drives into a single storage area. So everything can be shared across that. So it's usually rated. And again, it's like a server on steroids. It does not include a file system. Over here we have one, but here we do not. This, the fiber channel, the SCSI, and or the A over E Ethernet has to do with the link between this block storage and the network, the type of connection that we have there. And it can incorporate a robotic tape library in your SAN that way. Okay. Trying to advance the slide. Too far. Okay. Let's talk about optical discs now. There are 5 basic categories of optical discs. They include the ROM, which are your non-recordable discs. Those are the ones that you buy in the store with pre-recorded movies or music on the disc already. And that stands for read-only memory because you can't write to it. It's only a read device. Then you have the -R and the +R, sometimes called -R, +R, which means that they're recordable discs. And we'll talk about each of these categories a little bit in just a bit. Then we have RW, which means that there can be read and written to, which means re-recordable. I can erase the data and I can re-record it. We have +MO, which is magneto-optical. This is rare enough that I'm not going to spend any time talking about it in a subsequent slide. And then we have the +M, which is a new type of media. It is recordable, but it is permanent, as ROMs are also permanent. The basic formats also are different in their capacities. We're all familiar with CDs, that's compact discs, digital versatile discs, originally digital video discs, and now Blu-ray discs. And the capacities go up as we continue to move up there. So these are getting into some reasonable capacities, but there are some serious problems with increasing the capacity further than that. So let's talk now about optical disc ROMs. As I mentioned, that stands for read-only memory. They are stamped, and they're called stamped. It's actually plastic injection molding. So we take polycarbonate, inject it into this mold, which is a master, and the master has extremely small bumps on it, as you see here. And the plastic goes into that, and then we see these bumps. This is a scanning electron microscope picture I took of a CD that I took apart. So here's my polycarbonate layer down here. Then up here is my protective layer of lacquer on top of that. In between are my tracks, and you can see the tracks going at a slant here across there. So here's my track, and on top of that track is this very thin layer of reflective material. It's usually aluminum or silver. And that's what actually reflects. And then the label on the disc is up here. This is the example of a CD. DVDs and BDs are slightly different. But the laser actually reads through the polycarbonate and reads the disc through here and not from the top side. So as I mentioned before, these cannot be recorded because the data is manufactured into the disc. These bumps are made physically. The nice thing about those discs, though, is because the data is physical as well as optical. It has an extremely long lifetime, over 1,000 years according to the studies that I've read. Let's talk about the plus and minus R format now. That means rewrite or recordable. So you can record to these. The difference here is that these tracks have a die in them. Rather than bumps already being on there, the tracks are built into the disc, as you can see here. This is a scanning electron micrograph of a recordable disc. You can clearly see the tracks, again at a slant here. But you can't see the data. On the previous one, you could see the bumps in there, and so you could see where the data was. This is recorded, by the way, but you can't see it, the data. Here is a confocal microscope picture of that same disc. We can see the unrecorded area and the recorded area here. So the laser comes through and it illuminates the dye that is in this track. And when it's illuminated, its absorbance changes. So you can see here that these unrecorded tracks are dark, which means they absorb a lot of the light that comes into them. Over here, we've modulated or changed that absorbance and made it more reflective or transparent so that it sends the light back. Here it absorbs as it did before, but here we've changed that to being a light spot. So now you can see the ones and zeros there. But the point of these two pictures is this. The data in a recordable disc of this type, of the plus minus R, is optical only. It is not physical. You can see that here. An SEM, scanning electron microscope picture, is physical. It only shows what can be touched or diffract electrons, if you will. And so the data is not there. The tracks are, but you can't see the data. It's only optically there because we've changed the absorbance of that dye. But these dyes, because they are carbon-based, they are degradable, biodegradable, and they do degrade with time. And of course, they change as a function of light, which means if you leave these discs out in the light, the data will be lost. They also change with temperature and humidity, so you want to store them cool and dry, ideally, or a medium humidity, 40 to 60%. I see a question. What is the difference between plus or minus R and plus R discs in optical discs? And that's a good question, and it has to do with the type of dye and the format of the disc, and eventually how much the capacity is. And I don't remember which one's which. It's not terribly important, but one stores 750 megabytes, and the other one is something like 720 megabytes. And then the type of dye that is used and the actual way in which the laser illuminates that dye and records is different. As far as the user goes, there's no difference between plus R and minus R. All drives are capable of writing to both. You buy whichever type you want, and then you put it in, and away you go. There are some other differences that have occasionally arisen in the way that they're treated, but they're mostly a function of the program or the drive used to write plus R's and minus R's. Okay, so there's our recordable discs. Let's talk now about the next one. Oops, too far. There we go. Now let's talk about, I did talk about that already, but just as a refresher here, the dyes degrade with time. The families of dyes used are cyanine, phthalocyanine, which is a stabilized type, and an azo type of dye. And these have longer life expectancy than the cyanine. Then the last of these that I will talk about, as I mentioned, I will ignore two types because they're very rarely used. This is a new standard that came out just a couple of years ago. It's the -M, and it's the M disc made by a company called Millenniata. It's a very new type of disc. It does not use dyes. It uses inorganics. It's extremely stable. That's what it was developed for. And the life expectancy on these discs is over 1,000 years. For example, here's a picture of one using a scanning electron microscope. You can see that the data is very physical because it's diffracted the electrons in the microscope, but it's also optical, clearly, because we can read it with an optical disc drive. And the compatibility of this has been a bit of an issue. Just to address that, M-disk DVDs can only be written in an M-disk drive, an M-disk compatible drive. There are many of those out there, but not all of them are M-disk compatible. But they can be read on any DVD drive in the world. Okay, so written only on M-disk drives, but read on all drives. And by the way, all disk drive manufacturers now have the option of building M-disk compatible drives, and most of them are doing that. And now, that was the DVD. Millennia also makes a Blu-ray disc version, and that Blu-ray version can be read or written on any Blu-ray drive in the world. There are always some compatibility issues, but that's the case with the other standards as well, the plus minus R and so forth. But in general, these discs can be written and read on any Blu-ray drive that is a writer in the world, and they're very, very stable. Okay, next one is a summary of these various types of storage. So here we have a comparison of hard disk drives, the high performance one, and then the high capacity. Now, what do we mean by that? High performance means it has high IOPS, input-output operations per second. High capacity does not have as high of an IOPS rating, but it has a higher storage capacity. And over here, if we look at those capacities, the high performance typically top out at about 2 terabytes. The high capacity top out at about 4 terabytes. And there's a range of those, of course, always. Here's the IOPS of that one, and here you see the IOPS of the high capacity. Not a huge difference, 2 to 1 roughly. The data rates, 1 gigabit per second for the high performance, and half of that, 500 megabits per second for the high capacity. Their archival lifetime, as in the case for all hard disk drives, is about 3 to 5 years. I just noticed a mistake here, and for that I apologize. I don't know how I missed that. We'll talk about that next. Half-inch tape has an access time of typically 30 seconds. It is a sequential access, so if the file's at the end of the tape, that's going to take a minute or two. If it's at the start of the tape, it's going to take just a couple of seconds. So somewhere in the range of 30 seconds for an average. About only 1 IOPS, so these are clearly not intended for high performance or backup only. Data rate is 1 gigabit per second, so they do have a very high data rate once it locates the file. Archival lifetime should be listed here as 10 to 30 years. I apologize for that oversight. 10 to 30 years is a typical archival lifetime of half-inch tape. Over here, by the way, just a little bit of information about their typical power consumption. In active mode, meaning we're reading or writing to them, or standby mode, meaning that it's not in active read-write mode. Next, we have our optical discs. We have the ROM, the -R, or the +R for that matter, the RW, and the -M. And of course, these will all have about the same access time because they all use basically the same technology. They're all optical disc drives. Their IOPS rate is poor. They do not have a high I/O rate. Their data rate is relatively poor. Notice it's only 50 megabits per second versus the 500 meg or even 1 gig of these other upper options there. The archival lifetime of this we've talked about before, 1,000 years for the ROM version, about 5 years for the -R and the +RW. And by the way, about 5 years also for the +R format. The -M, about 1,000 years. The typical capacity we've talked about before, 700 meg for CD, 4.7 gig for DVD, 25 gig for Blu-ray. And then, of course, these are the same for these formats, whether it's CD, DVD, or Blu-ray disc. Same for the M-disc. I see a question that asks, is half-inch tape the same as the LTO tape? And the answer is yes. That's a great question. LTO, which stands for linear tape open, which we will talk about more in a subsequent slide, is the standard that has been adopted for the last about 20 years for half-inch tape. So more on that in a subsequent slide. Then finally, we have flash memory, and by flash memory I mean our flash drives or our solid-state drives. They are made out of the same thing, but they look different to the computer, and of course they look different to your naked eye, but that's not the point of it. So the flash memory has a very nice access time. Notice that everything else up here is dreadfully slow compared to flash memory. Its access time for reading is only about 100 nanoseconds. I should mention that its access time for writing is about 100 times slower. It has a slower write rate. But still, that's orders of magnitude faster than any of these other storage options. It's IOPS. That's where you get the high IOPS rate. If you're going to get 1.5 million IOPS, it's not going to come from any of these options here because they're just too slow to support that. It will come from your solid-state drives or from your flash memory. Data rates in the 500 megabits per second or even higher, so very, very high performance. Lifetime, archival lifetime is about 10 years. Don't expect it to last longer than that. The typical capacity nowadays is about 256 gigabytes, and then we see, of course, a little bit there about the power storage or the power consumption during the storage. Okay, now back to magnetic tape, as was asked before. So the original tape, of course, came in the large reels, these 10-inch reels of tape, which were loaded on by hand. Those were introduced in about 1951, and those were very common in the pictures of computers way back in the 60s and 70s. They required vacuum columns so that the tape could be accelerated and decelerated quickly over the head, and as I mentioned, manual loading. They were the de facto standard for backup and even for large amounts of storage for over 30 years because they did have much higher storage capacity than hard disk drives did. Since then, the IBM developed the 3480, and I just have to tell you that I was on the team that designed circuits for that. That was my job at IBM. So I'm thrilled to have been part of that team. That later developed into the 3590. You can see a picture of that cartridge here. It's about 4.5 inches by 5 inches. And you'll notice that that cartridge is almost the same size as the LTO cartridge, which was introduced a few years later, which started with LTO-1, and we're up to LTO-6 now, and there are future generations of LTO planned, each generation about 3 to 4 years apart. These drives are much less expensive than the 3480 and 3590 drives. They are only in the range of $2,000 to $10,000 for the drives. The cartridges are in the range of $30 to $50, so they're very reasonably priced. They're auto-loading, so you can put them in libraries and be picked by a picker and loaded up and so forth. And that's been the standard. Cartridge tapes have been the standard since about 1984. Here's an example, by the way, of a tape library. This one's by Storage Tech, and you can see all the cartridges loaded up here and here. And this machine here is the picker and reader. It'll pick up the cartridge and then take it over to the reader so you can read or write to that cartridge. So the options that I mentioned today are LTO 4, 5, and 6. And you go, what happened to LTO 1, 2, and 3? Well, unfortunately, the LTO storage standard has made the decision that the new generation of LTO will be backwards compatible only with the previous 2 generations. So when you had LTO 3, it was compatible with LTO 1 and 2, but when you moved to 4, it was only backwards compatible with 2 and 3 and so forth. So since LTO 6 is now the standard, it's only backward compatible with 5 and 4. So that does have an issue with backwards compatibility. There's also the T10000D storage option, and there's the LTFS storage option. Not as popular as the LTO, but certainly very valuable. They're great for large data applications. A library like this, since each of these cartridges can store up to about 10 terabytes, you can imagine how much one of these libraries will hold if it holds over 1,000 cartridges. So 1,000 times 10 terabytes would be 10 petabytes. They do have high data rates and very high capacity and a very low cost per byte. There isn't anything out there that I'm aware of that has a lower cost per byte except for optical. Optical actually is less expensive per byte. LTO and the versions 4, 3, and 2, and 1 seem to be quite stable in terms of life expectancy. The conferences that I've attended, people there have been saying, I've looked in the literature and haven't found it, but I've heard lots of people say the LTO 6 is having some serious life expectancy problems. And the solution to those problems seems to be refreshing, right here. The cons. Refreshing is becoming accepted practice. Refreshing means that I take these cartridges here and I write what's on them. I read everything that's on a cartridge and I put it onto a new one, an LTO 7, for instance, or simply a new LTO6 cartridge, or the same LTO6 cartridge I read it off of, because basically the data itself, the magnetic fields that are stored on there, are decaying fast enough that I have to refresh the data. And of course, if that's happening in the range of every 5 to 7 years, which is what I'm hearing, that means that you're constantly refreshing these cartridges, and that's a bit of an issue. But back to the pros, it is the most widely accepted archival solution. So all data centers, almost all data centers, will have a tape library somewhere for archival storage. If you need to go back to a certain day of storage, that's what it's going to be. It's not going to be on your hard drives. And that's because it's a relatively low cost per byte and it's quite stable over time. And as I mentioned, these library systems like the one you see here are fully automated. Very, very nice online storage. Access time, like I mentioned, about 30 seconds, but still it is available. Cons, the library systems themselves are in the millions of dollars. Not cheap stuff there. And as I mentioned, refreshing is an accepted practice, the price that you pay to store things on LTO. And as I mentioned before, each LTO version is only backward compatible with the past 2 generations. Whoops. I don't know how that happens. Okay. So here's a summary of half-inch tape over the last several years. Started with the Univac reel in 1951, the IBM reel in 1955, and then the 3480 cartridge, as I mentioned, in 1984, 3490, and later the 3590, that was in 1991, and then the LTO series, starting with the LTO 1 in 2000. And I skipped some in here because I didn't want to be exhaustive, but just representative. And you can see the various years in which these have been introduced. The amazing thing that we see happening here are the densities. And linear density is how close the bits are. This is bits per inch. Notice that we start way back in the 50s with 768 bits in an inch. It seems like a lot, maybe to our naked eye it is, but it's not to a computer. And then look to where we are today. We're up at 384,000 bits per inch. Just amazing. And then the number of tracks. And notice again, this is still half-inch tape. Tape is no wider, still just half an inch. But we started 8 tracks and we worked our way clear up to 2,176 tracks. And this is on a medium that is very wobbly, very hard to track. The heads actually have to move to follow the tape as it flies by the head because the tape is just a loosey-goosey medium. It's not very stable dynamically as it moves. But the data rates have gone up dramatically as well, from 12.8 kilobits per second to 160 megabits per second on the LTO6, or bytes per second, 160 megabytes per second, I'm sorry. These are all bytes per second. So that you multiply that by 8 to get your bits per second. Tape speed has been pretty constant, though. Way back in 1951 is about 2.5 meters per second. That went up to 2.8 with IBM's version. But once they introduced the cartridges, that dropped to 2 meters per second, which isn't a huge drop, but that's where it is today. Nothing much faster that I'm aware of than 2 meters per second. And the increase in the data rate is coming from the fact they have more heads, more tracks, and more bits per inch. These all have had a typical archival lifetime of 30 years, going down to about 20 in LTO with LTO4 and about 10 with LTO6. And again, this is what I've heard from people who are running these kinds of libraries. I've not seen any literature on that. I think the people are reluctant to confess that, but I will tell you that those in the practicing of this storage will have been telling me that that's what they are doing in order to keep the data refreshed. I see a question about, let's see, question here about LTO. LTO stands for Linear Tape Open. It's just a type of standard. Linear Tape Open. It's an open standard, so that's what it stands for. Oh, somebody already answered that. Sorry. Can LTFS be set up to attain speeds that are close to those of hard disk drives? If by speeds we mean access times, no, because tape is a sequential access, and that will always be much slower. But if by speed we mean the data rate, then yes, we can get tape speed or data rates that are fairly comparable to hard disk drives. And another question, are you going to talk about LTFS? One of my clients mentioned it. I'm not. I hadn't planned to do that. And because I don't know that it's of general interest, I'll just refer you to your favorite internet search engine. And I'm sure you can find a lot about LTFS there. I'm trying to advance to the next slide. This is just weird. Sometimes I have control, sometimes I don't. There it is. Okay, now let's talk about solid-state storage, the last of our options. We've talked about hard disk drives, we've talked about optical, we've talked about half-inch tape. Now we'll talk about solid-state storage. Way back in the 60s, we started with static random access memory, or SRAM. That means that the data on it is steady as long as you have power applied. So if the power is there, the contents are stable. It uses a 6-transistor design, so every bit requires 6 transistors to be stored. And if that doesn't mean anything, that's fine, but the comparison is, down here under DRAM, notice that it only requires 1 transistor and 1 capacitor to store each bit. So the bottom line answer here is that SRAM takes up more room, therefore it's more costly. So we don't usually have as much SRAM on our computer systems as we do DRAM. But it's faster. As you remember from a previous slide, it's about 5 times faster in its access time than DRAM is. And it's the primary type of memory used for cache memory today. And there's this thing called dynamic random access memory. And again, it was about the mid-1960s. And it's called dynamic because its contents actually change 1,000 times per second. That's why it's called dynamic. And you say, well, Professor Lunt or Barry, what good is memory that forgets what's stored there 1,000 times a second? And the answer is, well, 1,000 times a second is slow by computer standards, which means if I have to do it 1,000 times a second, it's lasting for a million computer cycles. So that's not bad. But it does mean that we have to design a special circuit called a refresh circuit that goes to every single bit, asks what it was, and then restores what was there a millisecond ago. And that's constantly going on. And if that sounds ridiculous, that's okay, it is. It is ridiculous, but that is what's going on. And that's why it's called dynamic, because it's always changing, which is why this is called static. And it's the charge on this capacitor that is the data, the 1 or the 0, and that charge just leaks away fairly fast, actually. But it's the primary type of main memory today. And as I mentioned before, if we talk about how many gigabytes you have of memory, then we're asking about the DRAM. And then finally, finally for this slide, we have read-only memory, which again was invented in the mid-60s. It's non-volatile. It's extremely permanent, easily 1,000 years. And it also uses just a 1T design, doesn't even need a capacitor. It's very high density. So a lot of nice things about it, but the problem is you can't record to it. That's why it's read-only. The data is created by the manufacturing process, just like our ROM disks that we talked about in optical. The data is stored by the manufacturing process. So no chance of storing that yourself. Let's talk now about some more types of solid-state storage. And I told you I would mention what solid-state means. Back in the days of the transistors, they wanted some way to compare that to vacuum tubes. Well, vacuum tubes use gaseous state or a vacuum state of matter. And of course, transistors were made out of silicon or germanium, and that's solid. So rather than refer to them as transistors, the general category was called solid state as compared to vacuum tube valves, or tubes. Okay, so that's solid state. Back to PROM. Looks like our moderator is going to need to keep their computer from restarting. That's not my computer. I'll give control to our producer. They will postpone that. Okay, and we're back. So PROM is a programmable type of read-only memory, and it was invented just a few years after the PROM. It's electrically programmable, but it only can be programmed once. It's like a recordable disk, a dash or plus R type. You can record to it once, but you can't erase it. It had some problems with reliability, and it's no longer produced. Then along came the EEPROM, which is erasable, programmable, read-only memory, and you think, well, if it's erasable programmable, let's rewrite. That's what we're looking for, something that's non-volatile and can be written to and erased. And it is, but you have to expose it to ultraviolet light to erase it. Not very practical, which is why, by the way, they have these little windows in them. There's a piece of, not glass, it's actually quartz, so that the ultraviolet light can shine through it, and on this disk it will erase the data. That's an EEPROM way back in the 70s. And it's since been replaced by flash memory, which I'll get to on the next slide. After EEPROM was EEPROM, electrically erasable programmable read-only memory. So now we didn't have to shine ultraviolet light on it, but it had a limited number of write cycles, in the neighborhood of 10,000. So it couldn't be used for memory that's constantly changing. And it had a write time that was about 100 times slower than that for SRAM or DRAM. But it was the precursor to flash memory. The difference between flash memory and EEPROM is not much. And I'm not even going to get into what that difference is unless somebody knows about how to do that and knows about the IC manufacturing process. Okay, now to flash memory, which of course is the star of the game today. And it comes in these memory sticks, as you see here, or it comes in solid-state drives. And the way it stores the data is, here's my transistor. I have a source and a drain and a gate. And I have a floating gate and a control gate. And I store the charge on this floating gate. And as that charge slowly leaks away through these oxide layers, then the data disappears. But it's a very slow leakage, 8 to 10 years being very typical. So I can store things on there that's a pretty long lifetime, so 8 to 10 years. It fixed most of the problems with EEPROM, and it became dominant in all forms of non-volatile memory. That's pretty much what's in all of your cameras, in your iPhones, or excuse me, your smartphones. Anything that has a lot of memory and it's non-volatile, it's stored in flash memory. As I mentioned, it stores the data as the charge on this floating gate, which will slowly leak away over a period of about 8 to 10 years. We get those. We take that flash memory and then we package it in a form that your computer thinks it's a hard disk drive, but because it's solid state, it beats the socks off of your hard disk drive in terms of its access time. It's 1,000,000 times faster. So it's very heavily used in industry today, although it's still more expensive per bit than hard disk drives. So it's often used in RAID, in NAS, and in SAN. It's often used as your video storage medium, certainly on your video cameras. That's what's used. But it has a relatively short lifetime expectancy because it's the same storage as your flash memory, solid-state drives are. Okay, we're nearing the end of this. We've gotten through a lot of material here. I think we have 2 more slides. So let's talk a bit now about how to monitor the health of the data in your archive. Most people that manage a digital archive will have regular readbacks and logs of the material. So you just have somebody that's hired, and their job is to periodically go out there and take whatever is stored, whether it's magnetic tapes or hard drives or optical discs, and read them and log what differences occur, or log if there are any files that cannot be read back. This is a useful way to do it. It doesn't take too much time, and it does give you file-level visibility into what's going on. For instance, if a particular file cannot be read, you know that there's something going on with this. The next method is a CRC checksum assessment. And now is when I want to say something about parity. Anytime we want to have a visibility into what's going on with the data, we store data about the data. And of course, that's what a log is. A log is data about the data. And your file system is data about the data. It tells us where the files are, and it tells the capacity of each, or the size of each file, and what its name is, and so forth. So that's data about the data. But there's another type of data, or metadata, that actually looks at the ones and zeros. And if I take 8 bits and compute from them another bit, I will call that a parity bit. So the parity can be either a 1 or a 0. It can be either even or odd parity. There's no advantage to either type of parity. But parity is only useful in detecting errors. It doesn't fix them. And it's also quite weak because it doesn't catch everything. CRC is another type of metadata, cyclic redundancy check. That's what CRC stands for. And basically what we do is we take the data. Let's say that I have a stream of 2 megabits. That's the size of a file, for instance. I take all those 2 megabits and I percolate them through a specific type of register that uses a specific type of feedback to calculate a particular sum. And we call it a sum, and it is a sum, but it's not the kind of sum that you and I think of when we add numbers together. It's a digital type of sum. But this checksum is unique and only will occur if that stream of bits is identical. So I calculate that checksum and I store it on the storage medium. Let's say it's a half-inch tape. So I store the checksum along with the data at the end of the file. Then when I read that file back, as I read the data, I calculate the checksum based on the data. Then I compare the checksum that I calculate as I read the data back to the checksum that's stored on the tape. And if the checksum that I calculate is different than the checksum stored on the tape, then I know that some bit somewhere in the readback process has changed, and I've got a problem. So clearly, if my CRC checksum does not agree when I read it back, I have something happening with the data. And so these CRC checksums are very, very useful. They're very widely used, and are good for that. But there's always a problem here, and that is that any storage medium, whether it's half-inch tape, hard disk drives, optical discs, or solid state, all of them use what we call error correction coding. And error correction coding is a special type of data about the data in which I store data in such a way that I can actually tell which bits are in error. Not just that there was an error, but I know which bit had a problem. The beautiful thing about binary is if you know which bit is wrong, and let's say it was a 0, then you know it should be a 1, because there are no other options. If you know that it should be a 1, but it was a 0, you just flip it and make it a 1, and vice versa. And so all you have to do is determine which bit is in error, and you can fix these bits. Well, this happens all the time. So, for instance, back to this CRC checksum thing. Here I am reading my bits back. Some of those bits are incorrect, always. If that scares you, I'm afraid it's true. You'll just have to deal with that horror. Certainly was true with my work at IBM. It's true with my work on optical discs. It's true that we always have errors, but the forward error correction, or the error correction coding that's stored on the storage medium, has enough data about the data that I can actually identify which bits are in error and fix them on the fly. And as I'm able to fix them, I do. And so if I'm able to fix them all, then my checksum that I read back will match the checksum that's stored. So the only problem that occurs is when I cannot fix all the errors. Well, that certainly happens. We've all experienced a disk that couldn't be read back, or a half-inch tape, or some kind of storage medium where the file had become corrupted, as we might call it. And that corruption means that there are bits that we couldn't read back correctly. They're permanent errors, is what we call them. The problem with that is that you can't easily monitor the health of your data. For instance, let's say that if my error correction coding can fix up to 2,000 errors in a file, and we'll just take that as a number, and I store the data. A year later, I read it back, and I have 100 errors. Okay, I can fix them all because I can handle up to 2,000 errors. Another year later, I check it again, and I now have 500 errors, but I can fix them all. So you never know that there were 500 errors. A year later, you have 1,500 errors. You don't know that because when you read it back, all 1,500 errors are fixed, and you see perfect data. Then the next year, you read it back, and you have 2,500 errors. Well, guess what? Now your file is corrupted. Now your file cannot be read. So the fact is that if you had insight into what's going on with these files, you could actually see that. You could see that I had 100 errors, then 500 errors, then 1,500 errors, and so forth. And there are digital analyzers available that allow you to do that. You can analyze all 4 types of these media. They're not cheap, and they're hard to know how to run, and they're hard to interpret. If you can interpret the data, it can tell you a ton about the health of your data. I certainly use those for assessing the health of the data that I've been researching. And it does tell you the bottom line health of the data because you know how many errors there were before correction. And as they start to go higher and higher and higher, you can see that my disk is going to fail, or my half-inch tape drive is going to fail pretty soon because my number of errors is going up. So this health monitoring is a very, very useful thing to do, and all three of these methods are effective, but clearly they go up in complexity and in the challenge of interpreting the data and making it useful in your particular application. There's a question I see that says, are there standard digital analyzers? No, yes, there are, but they're only standard in the industry in which they're used. My research area is in optical discs. There are a couple of companies that make analyzers. So yeah, there are standards. There are two of them, but their costs are in the range of $150,000 up to about $600,000, depending on the bells and whistles that you want to get with them. And of course, with those numbers, you can see right away that it's not very practical. Plus, running those pieces of equipment, you have to have hundreds of hours of training with someone who's very good at that in order to really understand how to use those and to understand the data. There are other companies that provide some general ideas of how the data is doing, and again, they're unique to each of the 4 different storage media: the hard drives, the tape drives, the optical discs, or the solid-state drives. Another question I see here: are checksums created and generated before or after error checking fixing takes place? And that's a good question. When I read data back, the data is corrected before I calculate the checksum. It's a really good question. If it were after, if I calculated the data before error correction coding, I would never get checksums to match. Never. You never read a file back and don't have errors. Maybe on solid-state drives, because the error rate is much lower. But on the other 3, hard disks, magnetic tape, and optical discs, you always have lots of errors. And then I see another question: is that applicable for all formats? And the answer is yes. Unfortunately, all formats are just as prone to errors as any other format. So let's see. Another question: are there checksum creating programs which you could recommend? Checksums are actually created by the hardware of the readback mechanism or the storage mechanism. So I can't recommend that because that's a function of the read-write storage mechanism. So if you buy a hard disk drive, you get the checksum generator that they give you. You cannot choose that. The checksums, by the way, are usually done in hardware. So you buy it when you buy the storage type, the storage device. Okay. And the last slide here, just to be sure, if you really want your data to last a long time, you never trust a single storage medium, simply because even the very best medium, even gold plates, if we could etch onto those can be melted. They can be destroyed in an atomic bomb explosion. They can be buried under rock, and you don't know where they are. So clearly, there's no such thing as an impervious or indestructible storage medium, and simply the solution of LOCKSS is very, very widely used. LOCKSS stands for lots of copies, keep stuff safe. I know. First time I saw that acronym, I thought, really? That's great. I love it. It's a simple idea, and it's also a program based at Stanford University. And that simply means if you're going to keep something, put it in 2 physical locations. Clearly, if I had data in New Orleans back in the time of Katrina, I would want something stored at least 100 miles away, north of there, or away from the seashore. So yeah, keeping data in 2 different physical locations is always a good thing to do. Geographical dispersion is an essential part of a long-term storage plan, because even granite vaults, which can't be destroyed by atomic bombs, can have a terrorist attack. Somebody could get in there and do something stupid. Of course, you will need a playback mechanism, because clearly storing just the medium alone will not give you access to the data because it's not human readable. And then the question, which type of standard should you use, open or proprietary? Unfortunately, there's no single best answer to that. Clearly, there are some open standards that have become so widely adopted that they're extremely useful just because everybody uses them. And an example of that would be the linear tape open format. Very, very widely used. There are proprietary ones, such as the optical discs. Those are there was a consortium of manufacturers that came together and came up with the CD, the DVD, and the Blu-ray control or standards, and those are proprietary, but they're so widely adopted and so widely used. 30 years for the CD and 20 for the DVD and 10 for the BD, and still compatible, backwards compatible, all three of them. Which you use is going to be depending primarily on what you're trying to store, how long you want to store it, and other factors that there may be out there. I'm looking to see if there are any other questions. I see one here that says, can you elaborate on the regular readbacks and logs process? Does this just mean playing files back, or is there something more to do it? What do you log? That's a good question. I'm going to speak from experience with a colleague of mine with whom I've written a few papers, and he is a librarian. He's in charge of digital archives here at BYU at our library, the Harold B. Lee Library. What he will do is have his, and they're usually students who are doing this, he'll have his students simply read all the files back from a tape or an optical disc. And if all the files can be correctly read back, which means you just can open the file, you just try to open the file. If you can't, then what you log is that the file was opened on a certain date. And if the file cannot be opened, you log that, and then you compare it to the last time that you did this, and then you know if a particular file, excuse me, a particular storage medium, half-inch tape or optical disc or whatever, is starting to have problems. Because clearly if you lose one file on a storage medium, it's probably not going to be long before you lose more files. And I believe we've addressed most of the questions. If there's still a question or a question that I have not addressed, please let me know. That is the last slide other than my concluding slide, which just says the credits. So I'm going to monitor the chat and see if there's anything more. Oh, a question. Are there automatic processes to do this controlled job? Yes, there are. There are a number of companies out there that will take your half-inch tapes in a library, of course, or your optical discs, and they put them in the library, and it automatically accesses them, pulls them in, reads the files from them, and writes a log of what's going on. So all the person has to do is load the library full of those storage options. So it's very nice. Those aren't cheap. They'll go in the range of $5,000 to maybe $100,000 depending on the capacity and a few other things. Any other questions? I don't see any more, so I will wait for a minute in case there are more questions coming in.
Okay.
Producer has control.
Any other questions? On behalf of the AMIA Online Continuing Education Task Force, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. The recorded audio of these sessions will be made available to registered participants. Please keep an eye out for additional information soon. New registrants will be able to register for the individual sessions on demand. Because this is the last webinar in the series, we'd like to encourage you to send us your feedback and let us know if there are other topics you'd like to see addressed. Thank you for participating, and thank you to Barry Lunt for another great webinar.
If I'm still live, I'd see two more questions. If you keep making copies and running checksums, the copies may be accumulating errors over time. They do, but not as a result of the readback process, just simply degradation that occurs as a natural process. Another question, are there any issues with delamination with the M-disc? No, the M-disc took a totally different approach, and their discs don't delaminate. At least you have to beat them up very hard to get them to delaminate. The other types delaminate quite readily. And that's it.